Hello friends, I am Abhilasha Agrawal. Today, let us go through the journey of Australian literature. Now, first and foremost, what is Australian literature? The answer to this question is any literary work of art produced in Australia is said to be Australian literature. As simple as that. Now, these Aboriginal or Indigenous people, they did not had any written literature. Rather, they had oral narratives. That is, at about 68,000 BC, the Aboriginal people came to Australia and settled here. They were the semi-nomads. These semi-nomadic art forms were mostly in the form of paintings and oral narratives through which they express their ideas and emotions. Now, initially, these native inhabitants of Australia, that is the Aboriginals, they did not have any written languages. However, their songs, folklores, legends, stories, they all constituted to what we can call as oral literature. So these Aboriginals, they did not have any written literature as such. They just passed on their songs and chants and whatever it was through oral tradition. So these stories, their chants, all these were passed on from generation to generation through oral narratives. As a result of which, many stories, most of the literature, it got lost or it got diversified, and also led to the developing of many languages also. Basically, literature, that is a written part of the literary work that started in your Australia in about 1788 with the coming of the European settlers. In the later part of the 18th century, when Europeans were exploring new lands and horizons in 1788, James Cook, Captain James Cook, he set up a penal colony at Port Jack, or now called as Botany Bay. Here, the convicts and criminals from the crowded prisons of London were transported to this isolated island of the newly discovered Australia. Hence, the earliest settlers that we see here in Australia were the criminals, and this can be said to be the beginning or onset of the written literature in Australia. Now, see, what were the prominent themes that these writers or convicts or the European settlers, rather, they used to write? They wrote about the landscape and environment of Australia, the vegetation, the wildlife. Then they talked about the culture and traditions of the indigenous, that is the Aboriginals. Through their writing, whatever their observation was about Australian culture, they used to write about that. Then the identity of the settlers, what is their own identity? They were the colonizers in this newly found land. Then the writings also reveal the feelings of isolation and estrangement in the isolated island of Australia. So all this is revealed as prominent or major themes in their writings. And of course, the migratory experience, the long journeys on ships, shortage of food, then sanitation, as a result of which they caught many infectious diseases, and all these things have been discussed through their writings and their works. So these writings of Australian literature, that is the people living in Australia, whatever they write is Australian literature basically. And this Australian literature can be divided into four major divisions, or we can call it as four genres of Australian literature, and they are as the ripping yarn, bush poetry, 20th century Australian works, and the Indigenous Australian literature or the Aboriginal writers. I repeat once again, the four main literary forms of Australian writings are, the first one is the Ripping Yarn, then the second is bush poetry, 20th century Australian verse, and the fourth one is Indigenous Australian literature or the Aboriginal writers. Now let's discuss all these one by one. First, let us see what is the Ripping Yarn. The Ripping Yarn is the Australia's oldest literary convention. They all tell tales of adventures and struggles of the settlers in an unfamiliar land. Now, the stories about nature, ecology, their relationships with place and people, all this is written in this particular genre of literature, that is the Ripping Yarn. The stories about natural disasters, their struggle to survive against all odds, fighting with dangerous and deadly animals in the forests and in this bizarre land, and the clashes with the Aboriginals. So all this is discussed through their writings, and this comes under the genre of the Ripping Yarn. This literature, this helped Europeans to get new knowledge about Australia. Moving on to the second genre is bush poetry. Now let us see what is bush poetry. According to Australian bush poets, Australian bush poetry is metered and rhymed poetry about Australia, Australians, and or the Australian way of life. So how the people are there, their culture, all this is written in this particular genre, that is the bush poetry. It is the most famous of all Australian literature. It tells stories of life in the wide open country of Australia. Some of the bush poets are Freedom, Henry Lawson. The poem is Freedom on the Wallaby. Adam Lindsay Gordon, The Sick Stock Rider, and Banjo Patterson, Waltzing Matilda. Waltzing Matilda is also known as the unofficial national anthem of Australia. So this is about bush poetry. Let us move on to the next genre, that is the 20th century Australian work. With the coming of the modern age, new developments, new themes emerged during this time, like multiculturalism, feminism, and so on. So, the prominent writers under this genre include A.D. Hope, Judith Wright, David Malouf, Patrick White, Kenneth Slessor, Les Murray, and many more. And last but not the least, the fourth genre is the Indigenous Australian literature written by the Aboriginal writers, that we can classify under the Indigenous Australian literature or the Aboriginal writers. Indigenous Australian literature is the fiction, plays, poems, essays, and other works authored by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia. It is noticed recently in 1960s. They express their culture and struggles in this Australian land. Now, the major authors of this genre are Jack Davies, Kim Scott, Kate Howard, and Kevin Gilbert. Let us take a quick recap at what we learned in this session. First and foremost, what is Australian literature? It is the literature produced in and by the people of Australia, and how and when it developed from oral tradition of the Aboriginals to the written literature of the settlers. Then the prominent themes and the four major genres, that is the Ripping Yarn, the bush poetry, 20th century Australian works, and the Indigenous Australian literature or the Aboriginal writers. So all this we discussed in this session. Here we come to an end. Thank you.